Hi, this is a reading of MEG03 Block 1 and Unit 4, that is characters as characterizations. The structure of this unit is objectives, introduction, problems of characterization, point of view in fielding, typical and individual characters, Jenny Jones' character, social dimension of incest, realistic and comic characters, Jenny Jones, a character in the realistic mold, characters in the comic mode. Let us sum up glossary and questions. We won't be reading glossary and questions. We will just read till let us sum up. Let's begin. 4.0 Objectives. The aim is in this unit is to give, I think they have error here. The aim in this unit is to give you an insight into Fielding's attitude to society as exemplified in his portrayal of the comic and realistic characters. 4.1 Introduction. The problem. Characters in fiction refer to actual men and women in society. Women in society. They are visualized by authors in human and social terms. While reading a novel, you would have come across long descriptions of the appearances and habits of important characters. The author also gives information about their age, station in life, relationship with one another. However, I'm sorry, I'll just begin again. However, very soon we start hearing them speak in first person, which means that they are freed from the descriptive mode. The dialogue assigned to them puts them into a situation in which they have to carry out their specific plan of action. This plan of action is loosely called the plot, of which all characters are part of. The plot, then, is a plan or sequence of incidents which is important for us largely because it has men and women in it. Good writers pay great attention to the visualization of these men and women. They work and rework them to make the account appealing and realistic. They also select those aspects of society for depiction which directly relate to the characters. All aspects of the world captured by author combine so well with one another that the work gains an identity of its own. This is the problem. It is immensely difficult to separate one part of work for consideration while others are kept out of focus. Oneness and in oneness and indivisibility of a work. Are these parts a segment in a literary work which can be understood in separation? My answer is that a literary work can be considered a complete and unified whole and may appeal to the reader as such. We can go to the extent of comparing the work with a living organism to stress its oneness and integrity. There is a point in saying that a book cannot be split up in parts unless we want to murder it. Harsh words these, but we know that the effect of the literary piece on the reader is of a different kind than that of a philosophical treatise. I think I have to check this.
Treatise.
Treatise. Uh, I'm right here. Philosophical treatise. One way to explain this difference is to say that a novel or poem is indivisible and has what can be called its inviolability. But what do we make of the fact while reading a book that a specific aspect of it draws our attention more clearly than the others? To put it differently, how does it happen that in our discussion about texts, certain areas get exclusive emphasis while the rest are more or less entirely ignored? Some of these areas can be identified as characters, the opening and ending, as well as the process through which the action moves inexorably towards the ending. One or more recurring references, symbols, metaphors, myths, and the specific presence and role of the author. I'm talking of the classroom discussion of the seminar format under which the serious readers exchange their individual impressions about a work with one another and assess the validity of one impression against the other. When I say in our discussions, I have to be aware of the significant encroachment the serious student of literature makes on the work's territory. Its word with diverse segments of life, meaning thereby that divisions and separations of the kind reflected in impressions actually take place not in the text but in the mind of the reader. All discussions about literature, the whole critical enterprise stands upon this exertion and effort of the reader to make sense of the book in her or his individual context. A consideration of aspects and parts, they are arbitrary divisions of a book helps us as it critically read it as its critical readers to enter into nature and spirit. No doubt the divisions contribute mightily to our comprehension of author's urge to share his or her response to the prevailing environment. It is this urge, this response of the particular author, which constitutes the work's distinctiveness or inviolability. The unifier of the work being its maker, we understand a lot more acutely the author's word, social and cultural, through his work, his particular response to it. The common reader versus the critic. But there is another format, that of the comprehension of a literary piece by the common reader, the educated sections in the larger society, as different from the specialist reader, the student of the literature, and the critic. The common reader may not be professionally interested in seeing those nuances which presumably take our response to a higher plane. He or she may instead seek a direct link of the work with the world surrounding him or her. This happens many a time in the case of the works which reflect specifically on the contemporary issues. The common reader may feel that the book in the question, the poem, the novel, the play, contains a message and a statement about the actual situation of the time. The question is, how do we, as a serious, uncommon readers of the literature, deal with such an attitude? In my view, the idea of literature as carrying a message should always be cherished, though we notice that most of the criticism coming from the Western Academy, uh, I think I have to read this. I think there is some mistake, or I would have to just check for it. Okay, this is a word. Academe. 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 Okay, academy. Academe. Academe. Okay, fine. So we'll read this again. In my view, the idea of the literature as carrying a message should always be cherished, though we notice that the most of the criticism coming from the Western academe has disregarded it. The academy in the first word, the academy in the first word, that is how they have to be called by us, tends to divide the human creative, intellectual endeavor in separate compartments: economy, politics, philosophy, print, and audiovisual media, ideology, literature, theater, linguistics, the arts, etc. Under this scheme, the message has been assigned to politics, ideology, or the media. Literary criticism, on the other hand, has to come to gradually constitute the internal areas, the linguistic textual aspects of a book. But can we, the members of the third world society, which stands deprived of even the basic means of subsistence, afford the luxury of a common room or seminar format? In fact, Raymond Williams reminds the reader in the developed world of the West that literature should be firmly placed in the society. 4.2 Problems of Characterization. To my mind, characters afford important clues to the author's attitude and response. They enlighten us about the way the author's mind works in the process of understanding human personality within a particular system. But before I comment on a character or a set of characters in Tom Jones from the angle of human personality, I wish to state that a character in a work of fiction is always a symbol, a concretized pattern of social behavior. What I simply what I imply is that social behavior can be a good subject of comment. You can call a particular behavior good, bad, or just acceptable. This goes against the notion of that character who cannot be analyzed except in psychological terms. An individual an individuality captured in a novel has nothing to do with a flesh and blood human being. It is a represented individuality, not an actual one. Let me explain further. A character's representation, or what is called characterization, reflects essentially upon, tells about, its representer or creator, the author, and not upon the personality which a novel appears to contain within itself. Arnold Cattle Arnold Cattle struggles with the idea throughout his two-volume study, An Introduction to the English Novel. But Cattle does not resolve the dilemma between what he calls life and pattern, and merely settles down to accept what he considers two separate types of fictional works under the categories of life and pattern. Cattle has argued that there Cattle has argued that there can be a certain type of character which engages the attention of the reader in realistic experiential terms. A realistic experiential terms. I think I'm pronouncing this wrong. Let's look up for this. Experiential. I think we were somewhere close. Let's read this again. The Cattle has argued that there can be a certain type of character which engages the attention of the reader in realistic experiential terms. The reader feels the way the character does, and that the reader enters the emotional world of the character. For Cattle, this is life as captured by a novelist. Cattle's category of pattern, the opposite of life, stands for the author's moral or social viewpoint. To my mind, it does not vitally matter whether a character has more or less of life in the sense Cattle understands the term. I also add that the recognition of life in a character in fiction may induce us to unnecessarily explore his or her psychological depths. How does a critic do it? Of course, we read a number of books which analyze a character's mind, going, for instance, into the reason why Maggie in the middle on the floor, decides to run away with Stephen Guest. However, the question is whether we explore her mind or study the factors that influenced her perception. Such a critical exercise tells us not about Maggie but George Eliot. I reiterate that the character in the fiction is finally an extension of the author's consciousness. On the other hand, the reader, in the course of reading a novel, gets acquainted with author's understanding and point of view. Point of view in Fielding. In Fielding's case, identifying the attitude is not a problem. Unlike most English novelists, Fielding clearly states his socio ideological position. When he, as an author, does not like particular character or is critical about an issue, he offers he offers sharp comments to tell his disapproval. Of course, while doing so, he adopts the comic mode, and we have to admit that his repertoire of comic devices is immense. Nevertheless, none among the readers is ever left in doubt about the author's critical stance. If found unacceptable, things and people are ridiculed and exposed unambiguously in his works. It is also to be asserted that the more than the comic devices and dramatic presentation of events and happenings, it is Fielding's remarks which enlighten and alert the reader. To say that the Fielding is always ironical and seldom forthright in his remarks is wrong. The fact is that his comments are largely informed by that deep commitment to virtuous conduct, which is the result of his strong involvement in the social affairs. Consider the non comic and quite assertive tone of this statement. I would not willingly give offense to any, especially to men who are warm in the cause of virtue or religion. I hope, therefore, no man will, by the grossest misunderstanding or perversion of my meaning, misrepresent me as endeavoring to cast any ridicule on the greatest perfection of human nature, and which do indeed alone purify and ennoble the heart of a man and raise him above the brute creation. To miss out on this serious aspect of comment which the author shares with his reader would deprive us of much which in Fielding's view is the wisdom of human life. This forms an important part of character presentation. Typical and individual characters. The two concepts of typical and individual can be gainfully employed to understand Fielding's characterization. Typicality stands for the broader traits of a person's behavior. Under this view, a clergyman as a member of the profession and a maidservant would behave as all clergymen and other maidservants of the period. In the use of typicality, the writer's aim is to suggest that a society largely molds and shapes the behavior of its members. The men and women living at the time bear the stamp of their society and its ways. While representing characters this way in a work, the writer implies that there isn't much need to explore the deep urges and desire of people. In this sense, the typicality of a character becomes a significant means of gaining insights into the reality of particular historical epoch. I think I will have to search for this word.
Epoch.
Epoch. Okay, yeah, I was wrong. So I will read again from here. In this sense, the typicality of a character becomes a significant means of gaining insights into the reality of particular historical epoch to which the author belongs. But the concept of typicality by itself does not appreciate specificity and distinctiveness in a character. It swears too much by the general. The individual in a character could mean two things. Firstly, it denotes that the sensuousness which draws the reader close to the character okay, establishes, establishes. I'll just look up for the pronunciation. Establish, establishes. So let's read again. The individual in the character could mean two things. Firstly, it denotes that the sensuousness which draws the reader close to the character establishes an imaginative link between the two, and the reader becomes one with it. Authors achieve it through the psychological projection of characters, in which not just the decision taken but the processes through which the particular person reached his or her resolutions are communicated to the reader. There is a whole aesthetic argument based upon the character's individuality and sensuousness, which certifies that the characters or even the whole novel's authenticity. This stands in the opposition to another character who is merely typical and therefore stands for an idea. This, as I see it, is a narrow view of concept of individuality. If we adopted this view, we would be constrained to believe that the feelings novels and the characters in them lack the verve as well as delicate sense of feeling in a situation which is the hallmark of intensely human writing. More, we might even visualize opposite polarities between the typical and the individual, the former standing for the social and the latter for the human. The second meaning of the individual has greater validity in that it points towards the particular phenomena of, of which a character is a part. In fact, we cannot separate a character from the larger phenomenon under whose specific, because historically created at a juncture, rules it operates. Okay, we need to read this again. In fact, we cannot separate a character from the larger phenomenon under whose specific, because historically created at a juncture. Okay, I think we skip this and we'll read this again. In fact, we cannot separate a character from the larger phenomenon under whose specific rules it operates. Specific is because historically created at a juncture. Fiction criticism should go into this relationship between the character and the phenomenon and find out the way in which the two create a specificity together. Thus, we see that the peculiar pattern of events presented by an author may or may not impart sensuousness and authenticity in human terms to its actors. It may not show them as breathing and living, and yet engage the reader's attention in its description because of the close identification the presented pattern may establish between the reality of the work and that of the reader. Do we not generally think of our own word, go over our fears and predilections while reading a good novel? In this sense, the Fielding's character may in fact be more real and untheoretical than, for instance, those of Richardson. Jenny Jones' character. To illustrate this, let me deal with Jenny Jones' character in Tom Jones at some length. Jenny Jones has been shown in three phases: as a young woman, when she found herself to be much brighter than others in the neighborhood. As a middle aged person, when she met Jones for the first time at Mazard Hill, and finally, as one surrounded by suspicious glances but quite on her own in London. To begin with, let us address the question: what could be the motive of the author in presenting her in Somersetshire as a keen and intelligent student as well as a sensitive individual? The author derives a great deal of pleasure from her virtuosity, which in a mere maidservant would be out of place. This makes her highly unpopular in the neighborhood, particularly among women who feel threatened by her qualities of mind. That she wins close intimacy and friendship with Miss Allworthy is proof of her impressive accomplishments. Does Fielding wish to impart those comic heroic qualities to her as a character which he visualizes in number of struggling individuals from the lower classes? Consider Fanny, Joseph, and Parson Adams in Joseph Andrews. My answer would be in the affirmative since Fielding chooses Jenny Jones as a character to emphasize a high degree of dynamism and agility. Also, is it not the author's purpose to use her as a fictional device through which the blind prejudices as well as stupidities of the majority of people can also be pinpointed? Add to this the virtue of patience and forbearance discernible in her behavior when Mr. Allworthy so elaborately castigates her for the sin that she has not committed. Her loyalty to Miss Allworthy is not ordinary. The quality of her sincerity to a trapped woman would do even Sophia Western proud. Of course, the reader is to believe till the very end that she is the mother of Tom. Keeping this in view, it is not hard to connect some of the traits and abilities of Tom with those of Jenny as his mother, strengthening the assumption that the mother of the protagonist has an importance of her own and is by that logic a character of prominence. Her expulsion by Allworthy from the neighborhood of the Paradise Hall is the height of attention she has received in the beginning of the novel. And the problem in the first phase of Jenny's career is that just when she has raised extreme expectation as an important character, she is made to disappear as Jenny Jones from the world of the novel forever. Again, the question is why? As we review her second phase, we find that Jenny has undergone radical change and become an altogether different person. It cannot be said that Fielding's characters are static, that they tend to retain throughout the novel their initial shape and form. Some of the characters may be of that kind, they may play a simple unchanging role, conceived as they are in humorous mode. It is a functional role assigned to serve particular demands in their case. This will this we will consider later in the discussion. What I say at this point is that Jenny Jones as Mrs. Waters cannot be easily recognized in the view of so much happening to her in the previous 19 years. For instance, she has acquired a new name not just formally and technically. Instead, she has over the long period become a typical army officer's woman, unsettled, sexually exploited, stupid, insensitive. Where are those qualities of head which put her substantially above the most women in Somersetshire? What has remained of the old person in Mrs. Water is the habit of striking easy relationships on the sly. The change is from an intelligent young woman to a clever, calculating middle aged woman. Fielding not only recognizes this change consciously and remembers the kind of person Mrs. Waters was when young. He also keeps in his view the social process in which the transformation has occurred. Even ordinarily, the feeling is fond of charting the life course of the characters, that is, sharing the information with the reader about significant past happenings in the life of the characters. While there may be other fictional purposes, such as intensifying the plot structure behind these numerous discourses, Fielding presents one quite important motive in the present case is that the author puts almost the whole blame for the moral mental decline in Jenny Jones at the door of society. This is done deftly in terms of characterization, under which we see a whole system and structure critiqued through Mrs. Waters. It may as well be said that the crudities and immoral ways in Mrs. Waters are in fact instances of the brutal rigidity. All right, I'll look up this word.
Rigidity.
Rigidities, rigidities, rigidities. Hmm. It may as well be said that the crudities and immoral ways in Mrs. Waters are in fact instances of brutal rigidities of the society in which she has lived and of which she is a mere victim. Fielding works to a plan as he shows Mrs. Waters caught in the web of circumstances. Think of the situation in which Tom meets her for the first time. A woman stripped half naked under the hands of a ruffian. Okay, I have to look up this word again.
Ruffian.
Ruffian, yeah. Hands of a ruffian who had put his garter round her neck and was endeavoring to draw her up to a tree. She faces an attempt at robbery by a desperate criminal in a forest where chances of getting help are remote. The atmosphere is vile in more senses than one. After she has struggled for a while, Mrs. Waters is in a state of total incapacity as she is shouting to be saved. This resembles the natural behavior of an animal to ward off animal to ward off the blow and escape injury. On being rescued, Mrs. Waters turns and almost instantly into the impulsive mode of sexuality. This seems understandable in those surroundings. The incidents subsequent to this at the Upton Inn are hilarious on the surface. Actually, they also take effect under a pattern which is highly oppressive. The threats held by economic subsistence, economic subsistence, moral principles, social etiquette, manipulative strategies of the lower people, all forming a sophisticated network at the inn which be seen as evolved for preventing animals to gain liberty. This I call the general plan, elaborately conceived and executed by the author. But the plan is only a plan, a framework. Mrs. Waters, as a character, may or may not adhere to the code which the framework seeks to impose on the members of society in general. And the strength of Mrs. Waters as a character lies in that she assiduously violates the code while her physical energy is constantly sapped by the intense pressures of struggle. But she is weakened physically by the various assaults from the centers of power, a husband in search of absconding wife, a father closely following on horse his daughter so that he can capture her and hand her over to a husband in marriage, a young woman in pursuit of a lover, husband, etc. These are not merely threaten these not merely threaten Mrs. Waters' privacy with a lover, but also also end up in snatching that lover who grows conscious by and by about the value of purity, loyalty, and virtue. Looked at from her angle, Upton Inn is a battleground where she loses, physically, most of what she longed to achieve, but she does not give up. If she is lively and entertaining player at the Upton Inn, a highly successful comic character, it is because she has been presented in concrete terms by the author. She breathes. This is this I call a concretized character in whom the typical traits have been highly individualized. I borrow the phrase from the George Lucas. I think I don't know Lukács George one Lukács. Okay, I really don't know what this is, but I'll read and I'll say X here. I borrow the phrase from X to call this concrete typicality, which in my opinion is a strong point of characterization. 4.2.4 Social dimension of incest. In the third and the last phrase of Mrs. Waters, in the third and last phrase, Mrs. Water appears just one of the many characters who have converged upon London to be of some use in resolution of Tom's problems. But is her presentation of individuality by the author compromised in the process of moving towards the city? I do not think so because, in spite of the horror caused by the revelation that she is Joan's mother, she strikes the reader as a person who committed the sin of the incest with the least awareness. Secondly, the incest has individualistic, moralistic overtones. The individual is condemned to remain in a mental state of sin by a society whose moral code he or she has willfully or otherwise violated. But it is to be interpreted and judged in a society which has given birth to much graver distortions of morality and ethics. There is a kind primitivism in incest, and the act points towards the distant past when relationships had not yet become fully and properly defined, and that this has given a vague and mythical dimensions to a violation of social codes. On the other hand, the 18th century London society hides much moral sexual distortion beneath the veil of secrecy and gradually reduces male female interaction to a self seeking manipulative level. Okay, there is a lot of noise in the background. Let's wait. Let's start. To put it more clearly, hypocrisy is much a greater sin for feeling than incest because in the former case there is falsity and dishonesty to which an individual consciously commits himself or herself and society discreetly overlooks the act. However, in the later case, the individuals involved, as well as the sympathetic towards them, feel horrified and morally repelled. Fielding, as author, is quite clear when he says, both religion and virtue have received more real discredit from hypocrites than the wittiest profligates. I will look up this.
Profligate.
Profligate. VTS profligates of or infidels could ever cast upon them. Nay, Father, as these two, in their purity, and rightly called the bends of the civil society, and are indeed the greatest of the blessing, so when poisoned or corrupted with fraud, pretense and affectation, they have become the worst of civil curses, and have enabled man to perpetrate the most cruel mischiefs to their own species. I'll read this again. Both religion and virtue have received more real discredit from hypocrites than the wittiest profligates and infidels could ever cast upon them. Nay, father, nay, farther, as these two, in their purity, are rightly called the bends of the civil society, and are indeed the greatest of blessings. So, when poisoned or corrupted with fraud, pretense, and affection, they have become the worst of civil curses and have enabled man to perpetrate the most cruel mischiefs to their own species. Incest is viewed differently. On knowing that the Mrs. Waters, with whom has been to the bed, is none other than Jones' own mother, Jenny, Patridge's face looks paler than ashes, his eyes fixated in his head, his hair standing on the end, and every limb trembling. In fact, the moral social code regarding the incest gets further established through the feeling of the horror. Soon enough, the reader gets to know that those considered guilty of the act were innocent. Retrieval of Tom and Mrs. Waters from the tight spot. It is a different thing that Mrs. Waters knew all along that she has never mothered a child, makes all heave a sigh of relief. Again, incest to Fielding in the last pages of the novel is an act that is committed only once or a few times, but an act nevertheless. Compare this with the goings on the London. Compare this with the goings on in London undercover, and which the London society wilfully ignores. We can scarcely term Lady Bellaston's effort at engaging Tom as a lover an act. Instead, it is an elaborately planned practice. 4.3 Realistic and Comic Characters. 4.3.1 Jenny Jones, a character in the realistic mode. The question we can pose is, how does Fielding characterize Jenny Jones as Mrs. Waters in the third phase? Firstly, she is not as much in focus in this phase as she was at Upton. Her role towards the end of the novel becomes totally subservient to the interest of Tom. Perhaps she has now lost the capacity to substantially influence the course of action in the novel. Why? Is it because the novel is supposed primarily primarily to be the story of Tom and Sophia? To say that the Fielding is interested in showing how Sophia and Tom finally managed to get married would be to miss the whole point. Of course, the of course, apparently the novel places Tom and Sophia at its center, but at a deeper level, it is about the world with which they are confronted, the world in which they have to live and under whose logic they have to construct a relationship. Jenny Jones also ends up getting a clearance from Mr. Allworthy about her transgressions. The question can still be asked, where would Jenny Jones go now? Tom's difficulties have been overcome as he turns out to be the nephew of Mr. Allworthy. As a consequence, distinction of birth is bestowed upon him. Having seen that Tom is a respectable person of the gentleman class, Squire Western loses no time agreeing to give his daughter's hand to him. But the whole arrangement, the whole solution appears to be a mere joke in comparison with what Tom and Sophia have gone through previously. This is the crux of the matter. Tom and Sophia unite only comically, with a great deal of wrestling and effort on the part of the author. In a significant sense, they do not marry because the logic of the specific circumstance does not permit it, their final fate being as problematic as that of Jenny Jones. At the same time, Jenny Jones should be understood in the terms of a realism as one who typifies the fate of all underprivileged women in England. Mark the number of such women in the novel. Molly, her sisters, and the mother, the landlady, and Susan, the chambermaid at the Upton Inn, Mrs. Miller, Nancy, etc., uh, and a view of the hardship they undergo not merely at the sexual level but also on the economic social plane is complete. One can scarcely overlook the hurts that the life has given to these women. Fielding quietly, vividly presents these women and exhibits a great deal of fellow feeling for them. One is struck by Fielding's portrayal of Susan, the chambermaid at Upton, whose lips were so large, so swelling, could be perceived in them, and moreover they were so hard that a fist could hardly make an impression on them. In spite of the humor, the crude violence to which ordinary women were subjected is not lost on us. Let us remind ourselves that Jenny is one of these women. The only difference is that she is mentally better equipped and can, on that strength, communicate more impressively with her superiors. Because of this, she receives a hostile response from others. Even the best of men in the novel, Mr. Allworthy, think, thinks it is proper to throw her out of the place altogether on the account of moral outrage she is supposed to have committed. Mr. Allworthy has been given the charge to keep the social surroundings morally clean. The punishment of the expulsion is also meted. I think this is meted, but let's find out.
Meat.
Meted. Meted. Is also meted out to Pettridge, but Jenny Jones is to suffer more than him. Being a woman, she is fated to be abused sexually in the world ruled by patriarchal notions, chastity, propriety, loyalty, etc. Keep in the mind that the ideological environment of England at the time, a woman as privileged and protected as Sophia would invite crude verbal assaults. Consider what Ensign Northampton says about Sophia at the Upton Inn. I knew one Sophie Western lane that lane with by half the young fellows at Bath. Squire Western appreciative remarks about Tom's free and reckless affairs with women, his victories and conquest come to mind. 4.3.2 Characters in the comic mold. I have so far talked about Jenny Jones, who belong to the category of realistically drawn character. These characters face threats and challenges from their society, which they are born to bear with. They give that impression. Their tragedy is that the novel is not focused upon them. As a category, these characters from the realistic background, this being their true function. However, the comic category of comic character is different. They influence the action in a major way. Comic would include, apart from Squire Western, Miss Western, Thwackum, Square, Mr. Allworthy, and Blifil. Fielding's comprehension of these characters is in terms of an idea that is along abstract theoretical lines. Alright, I'm reading too fast, I should slow down. They could be defined as Mr. Good and Mr. Spontaneous, Mr. Evil, Mr. Hypocrite, Miss Aggressive, etc. Feeling seems to have evolved the whole concept of the comic character. This has little to do with comedy of humors of the previous century and before. Feeling has departed from the comedy of humors by making extensive use of real and concrete situation in which the action is made to take place. The arena of action is not human nature, the essence of human behavior on the earth, which is human beings' temporal home. That is why events and situations in Tom Jones are persistently called history. If Tom Jones were not history, for instance, but a revelation of human nature for the purpose of preserving it from evil, it would have been a different sort of writing. Fielding tests the efficacy of qualities the comic character represent in actual surroundings. This enables him to evolve a new kind of characterization, that which embodies initiative and optimism. Also, he stresses the desirability of these qualities in his own society. The reader is compelled to examine larger tendencies that the character drawn that the character tendencies that characters drawn under this mode symbolize. See the contrast between Cheney and Mrs. Fitzpatrick realistic mode on one side and Mr. Allworthy and Blifil comic mode on the other. 4.4 Let us sum up. Fielding wishes to share with the reader the firm belief that it is possible to attain goodness and virtue in life, making his comic characters as part of this positive struggle. Fielding shows to the reader the fundamental value of virtuous human conduct. Most of the comic characters in Tom Jones' taste defeat temporarily and permanently in pursuit of their goal. Yet, all seem to gradually realize the true worth of one or the other moral principle. In the process of fighting along in life, they perceive that virtue in theory is not what it may come out in practice. Mr. Allworthy's humility in the presence of Sophia in the last book of Tom Jones is an eye opener. He could not see whatever happened before his eyes. Tom's parentage, Blifil's machinations. Okay, I will look up this.
Machination.
Machinations, Thwackum's complicity, etc. This is how abstract ideas fail in a world that is product of a variety of contending motives and perspectives and whose roots are in actual history. Allworthy's humility is the comic answer to the actual threats from the social forces which assume not only realistic forms such as Molly, Jenny Jones, Petridge, Mrs. Miller, Lady Bellaston, etc., but also comic forms Blifil, Thwackum, Squire Western. The two kinds of the characterization complement each other. They work under a perspective whose basic reference is the attainment of virtue and enlightenment through the continuous effort. And this concludes the reading of the unit 4, and we would not be reading glossary and the questions, and that would be it for this session. Thank you.